Welcome to Lessons in Humanities. Today's topic is going to be about the War of 1812. We will also discuss about some Native American conflicts, also the Monroe Doctrine, and the era of good feelings. If you're interested in this PowerPoint presentation or Google Slides presentation or other teaching or learning materials about history, please visit my Lessons in Humanities store. You can click on the link below. Let's begin. So, every lecture I like to start with a time period, a timeline, and we're in the time period between 1800 and 1848. So 1800 is significant because it's a new country, really. It was only 1776 that the United States began. And it was unclear if it could transfer from one party to another party. And that's what it did in 1800. It went from the Federalist Party to the Democratic Republican Party. And that was John Adams, the Federalist, to Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican. And it was peaceful. They were worried it was going to be some violence, but it was peaceful. And then we had some time with Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase and the Embargo Act. And then after them came James Madison, James Monroe. And we're going to talk about them today, about their presidencies. But this is the period from 1800 to 1848 where the United States is developing. It's becoming more capitalistic. There's more people, and they're moving to the west. They're getting more territory, like Louisiana, and then even more territory after the Mexican-American War, which happens in 1848. And that, because of the dispute between slave and free states, is going to lead to the American Civil War. So let's begin at the beginning here. So the presidencies, like I said, is going to be the fourth and the fifth presidents. It's going to be James Madison, and it's going to be James Monroe. Now, James Madison, you'll remember, is the the father of the Constitution. He was a very smart, small guy who developed the Virginia Plan and all these ideas that created the Constitution that is still used in the United States today. And then James Monroe is also a founding father. He's a veteran from the American Revolution. He fought with George Washington in the Battle of Trenton. And before the War of 1812, and that's what's in this picture here with Andrew Jackson, there were some conflicts with the Native Americans. And the Native Americans would also fight in the War of 1812. They would help the British. But that's what the war was. It was a war with the British. But before that, there was wars with the Native Americans. And the relationships with the Native Americans in the early 1800s were conflicted, right? Ever since the arrival of the Europeans, whether it be the Spanish, the French, the British, the Dutch, they all had different type of relationships with the Native Americans. All wanted to do trading with the Native Americans and try to live peacefully, but some relations were better than others. The British, it wasn't a very good relationship before it became the United States of America. But when the America began in 1776, the relationship was actually even worse. Because after the 7 Years' War, this is before the American Revolution, there was a Pontiac's Rebellion, Pontiac's War, where Pontiac and United Tribes were attacking the British, and the British didn't want that to happen, so they restricted Western expansion. Well, when the Americans won and they had a new country in 1776, it let all the settlers move to the west and take territory and take land and settle the west. And of course, there's going to be conflicts with the Native Americans. So the relationship was really not very good. But generally speaking, there was this idea at this time that the Native Americans were savages. And I say this is a broad generalization, right? Certain Americans, certain people had more respect for the Native Americans. For example, the Quakers, right? And also it depends on the different type of people. But generally speaking, there was this kind of attitude that Native Americans were savages. And you have to remember the Native Americans were a very diverse group of different ideas, religions, food, customs, housing. It wasn't just one type of people, right? A united group with all the same ancestry. These were all different tribes all over the U.S. And all over the different, the Western Hemisphere, really. But the Americans didn't really respect their property rights or their sovereignty. Many treaties were broken. They sign a treaty, say, well, you give us this territory and we'll let you have that territory. Well, 10, 20 years later, they would forget about these treaties. It should also be noted that after the treaty, after the American Revolution, you had the Treaty of Paris. And Britain and the United States were there, right? And of course, French and Spanish, they were also there. They were part of the war. But who wasn't there? It was the Native Americans. And they're deciding who gets what land. But the Native Americans had no representation at the Treaty of Paris. And the United States would constantly take more and more land. And then when the United States took over Louisiana, that's even more land to take over and more Native American land to encroach upon. But the important thing here is the Native Americans, ever since the Europeans arrived, I mean, the biggest problem was disease. It killed millions. But another problem that made it difficult for them to fight back against the different European nations and the Americans was they never united. There were so many different tribes that they often fought with each other, right? And they didn't really unite successfully to fight or resist the Americans. Now, Pontiac's War after the 7 Years' War was one example, and it was a successful example. But the most notable example is Tecumseh's Confederacy. So Tecumseh was this man of integrity, this warrior, respected by many Americans as well. His brother, his name was Tenskwatawa, and he was a prophet of the Shawnee tribe. And one night he had a vision. Now I should mention he was very drunk this night. He was passed out on the ground. People thought he was dead, and then he awoken. And he told them about this vision about resisting the Americans and resisting American culture by uniting all the different tribes west of the Appalachian Mountains. He preached revitalization of Native American culture, and it would be a conglomerate of different cultures and ideas, and even some Christian ideas. But Tenskwatawa and his brother Tecumseh, they united Native American tribes west of the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. Now there's going to be a battle. It's the Battle of Tippecanoe. Now, Tecumseh's Confederacy was headquartered in this little place called Prophetstown, named after the prophet, Tenskwatawa. Sorry for my pronunciation. Tenskwatawa. Okay. Now, Indiana at that time was not a state. It was a territory. To become a state, they needed enough people. They needed a legislative government. They needed to write a constitution, and then they would apply to Congress and they could become a state. So at this time, Indiana was just a territory. And it was governed by a guy named William Henry Harrison. Now, Tecumseh was out trying to unite. He was often trying to go out and unite different tribes. And it should be mentioned that not all tribes were willing to join the Confederacy, the Tecumseh's Confederacy. Some even joined the Americans. They decided to help the Americans. So he was very successful with a lot of tribes, but some tribes he was unsuccessful with. But nonetheless, William Henry Harrison knew about this resistance. He knew about Prophetstown and these ideas of resisting American expansion. So he brought in 1,000 soldiers to Prophetstown. And Tecumseh wasn't there. He was out trying to recruit more men. But Tenskwatawa was there. Tenskwatawa was a prophet, not a warrior. So this was a very easy defeat by the Americans over the Confederacy. And he burned the town. But the important thing here is Tecumseh's Confederacy. Even though Tecumseh is still alive, he's going to continue to fight. He wasn't there. Basically, the Confederacy is going to lose steam. And it's going to be over. This idea of uniting and maybe starting their own country, a united country, which would have been in the Ohio River Valley area or a little bit more west of that, Michigan area. But it was unsuccessful because of the Battle of Tippecanoe. So that happened in 1811. And it should be noted that William Henry Harrison became a hero, a war hero, and he used Tippecanoe to be remembered at. He was known as Tippecanoe, and he becomes president later, and his slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tyler was his vice president. But something that's also worth mentioning here is the Americans, they weren't already angry about the Native Americans and about what they were doing, they were angry at the British, because the British, who were in Canada, were supplying the Native Americans with weapons. And that brings us to these continued conflicts with the British. If you watch some of my other lectures, if not, please go back and take a look. There were some problems with the British. I mean, of course, there was negative sentiment towards the British. It's been a while since the American Revolution. Some people don't even remember it because they're so young at this time in the early 1800s. But the British were impressing American sailors on the Atlantic Ocean. So what does impressing mean? Impressing means basically kidnapping people and forcing them to fight in your army. And that's what was happening. See, the British were constantly fighting the French, right? In different wars, from during the French Revolution to the Napoleonic Wars, and even more than that. And at this time, it's the Napoleonic Wars, where Napoleon is fighting all of Europe, and they needed more soldiers, more navymen, sailors. Well, and they have a great navy, obviously, the British at this time. Well, a lot of the navymen, they didn't want to fight. It was poor living conditions. They might die. And the ships, they needed more people to work because the population still wasn't all that big in the United States. And they needed more people to work on the ships. So they offered a good amount of money, supply and demand, if you will. So a lot of British navymen, they would leave their country and join these ships, and they would work on these ships. Now, the British didn't like that. See, when you're British, at that time, you're British forever. You are British for life. So people didn't like that. But nonetheless, to get those men back, the soldiers, the soldiers or the navymen in the British Navy, they would board American ships, and they would look for these escapees, and they would forcefully take them back. But when they did that, they also took Americans, right? And sometimes maybe it would have been on purpose. Sometimes it might have been by accident. But they would impress the Americans into the British Navy, and they would have to go fight and sometimes die. And sometimes it was really difficult to prove that they weren't British and be sent back. It could take years. So this didn't make the Americans happy. It was happening for a long, long time, since the 1790s. And as I mentioned, the Americans were also not very happy about the weapons being supplied to the Native Americans, because the Native Americans were using this to kill Americans in wars or battles like the Battle of Tippecanoe. But not just that, to kill them, and maybe some settlers would move west and they build an encampment or a small village, and they would attack them. So there was problems with the British. And if you recall, in 1807, when Thomas Jefferson was president, they had the Embargo Act. And the Embargo Act, that was the cure. That was Thomas Jefferson's cure to stopping the British from attacking American sailors. He closed all the American ports, right? And at the same time, the French were also attacking American ships. Dangerous times in the Atlantic Ocean. Even the Barbary states were attacking American ships in the Mediterranean. So his solution was close all the ports. Well, this really hurt the economy. So when James Madison became president, he stopped the Embargo Act. But of course, British impressment would continue. So there's this idea about war, threat of war with Britain. Now you have to remember, when the United States or when the colonists defeated the British in 1770s, 1776, 1783 was the treaty. When they did this, that was an amazing victory. They couldn't have done it without the French, but they did, right? So fighting the British for this young nation, which was a little bit divided, right? It hadn't really developed, and there was differences between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans, the two political parties at the time, a little bit fractured. It was unclear if they could defeat the British. So a lot of people didn't want to fight the British. A lot of Americans didn't want to fight the British. The Federalists especially didn't want to fight them. But at this time, remember, we have a Democrat, just to review, we have two parties, the Federalists, which are the big government, the strong central federal government, right? And you have the Democratic Republicans. And these are the people who believe in smaller government, more agricultural. They supported the French. Well, at this time, we had Thomas Jefferson as a Democratic Republican. And then after that, we have another one. We have James Madison as a Democratic Republican. And in Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate were mostly Democratic, was a majority of the Democratic Republicans. And among them in Congress, we have what we call war hawks. And a war hawk is somebody who wants to go to war. And among them were Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. And if you're studying American history, remember those names, because in the early to mid 1800s, they're going to be very significant in Congress and with some compromises and some conflicts. They won't become president, but they will try. But the war hawks, with Henry Clay among them and John C. Calhoun, they wanted to go to war, right? They wanted to stop the British impressment, and they wanted the British in Canada to stop giving weapons to the Native Americans. Now, some historians have argued that they also wanted to take Canada for more territory. There was this idea of freeing Canada from the Britain. And the Canadians are like, we don't need to be free. So there is this idea of possibly taking over Canada. And if you look at the map today, that obviously does not happen. But anyways, with the influence from the Congress, James Madison, he didn't want to go to war, but he decided to go to war. And that brings us to the War of 1812. Now, this war is going to be very influential. Many people don't even know about this war, but it's very influential in American history. And let me try to explain why. First, let me explain the different theaters. First, there was the one in the Atlantic Ocean, where the Americans with their small ships were going to fight the British Navy. And they had a couple successes, to be quite honest with you. But the thing is the British, they were busy fighting the Napoleonic War, so they didn't have their full forces out there. But nonetheless, they had some successes. The second part of the war was 1813 to 1814, was in the north. And this was in Canada, Ontario area, also like the Michigan, Detroit area, and in the Great Lakes. So there's some battles there. The Americans would eventually conquer Lake Erie, which was a big success, but they didn't conquer Canada. They were unable to do that, even though they brought the war into Ontario and into parts of Canada. But it should be mentioned in this theater, in this part of the war, Tecumseh is going to be there, right? You remember Tecumseh and Tippecanoe? Well, he's going to bring some Shawnee fighters and some other Native American fighters to go to Ontario to fight with the Canadians, which he probably didn't want to, but with the British and the British Canadians against the Americans. And in the Battle of the Thames, he is going to be defeated. In fact, during this battle, the Canadians, they ran away because the Americans had them surrendered. So they ran away, or they surrendered. Some of them surrendered. Not Tecumseh and his fighters. They kept fighting, and he would die there. And Tecumseh became kind of a national hero, even though he was fighting against the Americans. William Tecumseh Sherman in the Civil War, a Union general. He'd be named after Tecumseh, right? There's even a statue at the Naval Academy in Maryland. It's actually not Tecumseh, but a lot of people call it Tecumseh. But my point here is Tecumseh does become a kind of a man that symbolizes integrity and hard work and fighting for what he believes. Now, at this time, though, around this time, the Napoleonic Wars in Europe are going to end. Napoleon is going to be defeated. And what does that mean for the British Navy? They can bring more people to fight the Americans in the War of 1812. And that's what they're going to do. And that's going to happen about the second theater in the north in the Great Lakes area, and also the south. So when they bring more troops, they're going to blockade a lot of the major ports in America, including in the Chesapeake Bay. And with more Navy men and more ships, they're going to go up the Chesapeake, and they're going to get to Washington, D.C. And they're going to burn Washington, D.C., including the White House. Now, James Madison, he's going to escape to a small little town outside in Maryland. But Dolly Madison was inside the White House when they were starting to attack. And she took two things with her. There was a slave there, and with the slave, they took a bunch of silver, so money, and they also took this beautiful painting of George Washington, which can still be seen there today, because they knew that the British, even though George Washington was dead now, and some of these soldiers were probably too young to remember the American Revolution, nonetheless, this was a traitor to the British, right? He's considered a hero in the United States, but a traitor to the British. So that's the burning of DC. And after that, after DC, they're going to go up the Chesapeake to Baltimore, and something significant. Now, this battle is not a big battle, but something special happens at this battle. It's the Star Spangled Banner, the American national anthem, will be written at this battle. So after burning Washington, the British Navy, they go up to Baltimore, and there's a battle at Fort McHenry. And during this battle, from a distance, there's a guy named Francis Scott Key, and he's watching the bombs bursting in air, and yet the flag was still there. He writes a poem. That poem will later become the American national anthem. So what I like to do is I like to play the American national anthem, and then you can watch it, and maybe you can try to envision what it was like to be there as Francis Scott Key watching the Battle of Baltimore. So after the Battle of Baltimore and DC, the British are going to stay and blockade some ports. They're going to go to the south near New Orleans. But this war was not popular. It was not popular to many people. It was not popular to the American people, right? Most people don't want to fight in a war. It wasn't popular to the Federalists. The Federalists was the opposing party of the Democratic Republicans, especially the ones in New England in the north. They really didn't like this war. Number one, they wanted to trade with the British, right? They wanted to continue to trade because it was more commercial. But this war really, nobody's really winning this war. The British don't want the war either. So, like all wars, it's going to come to an end, and they're going to sign what is called the Treaty of Ghent. Now, diplomats from Britain and from the United States, they would meet in Ghent in the Netherlands, which is now Belgium, Ghent, to end the war. And they're going to sign a treaty, which basically just brought everything back to pre-war conditions. So really, I mean, all that, the lives lost, the money spent, was just not worth it for the War of 1812. It didn't change anything, right? So why was it important? Well, the war is over. That's good, but is the war over? That's the question. See, the Treaty of Ghent, that is in the Netherlands. How long do you think it takes to get from Europe to the United States? Well, I mean, from Ghent or from Netherlands overland to, I guess, France or wherever they're going to catch a ship. It'll take some time, and then it'll take at least a couple weeks over the Atlantic Ocean. So when the war is over in the United States, the British Army and Navy and the American Army, they don't know that the war is over, right? So I told you that the British, they were blockading some of the ports, and they went down to New Orleans. Now, New Orleans is important because, just if you can envision it on a map, it's at the south, the southern part of the Mississippi River, and they could transport lots of resources and lumber down the Mississippi into the West Indies or the Caribbean, to the Sugar Islands, which were very valuable. So this was a very, very strategic, very important location. So they're going to go attack the Americans in New Orleans, and the Americans are ready. But remember, the war is over, but they don't know it. If they knew the war was over, they would just put down their arms and go home. They don't know that the war is over. The Americans, nor do the British. So 18 days after the Treaty of Ghent was signed, the British attacked New Orleans. Now, they had about 8,000 soldiers, the Americans 5,600 soldiers. In just 30 minutes, the Americans decimated the British soldiers. 62 Americans died and 2,000 British died. And the great leader of this was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, he was able to recruit Native Americans, Spanish Americans to build this team to prepare for the British, who are unorganized and not well planned for the New Orleans battle, and he destroyed them. And this is why the War of 1812 is important. Well, everybody thought that this was a great victory. Remember, nobody really likes this battle. Not this battle. They don't like this war. It's not popular in America. They call it Mr. Madison's War. A lot of people are unhappy about it. And the United States is kind of divided, right? Between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. It's not really united and patriotic. Well, this was a great victory, and this got into the newspapers. The Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson, this great, wonderful victory for the Americans, and they felt proud. They felt pride. They felt nationalistic. They felt patriotic, right? It kind of joined the country together, and all of a sudden, Mr. Madison, James Madison, the president, is popular. So he was very unpopular for most of his presidency, but now he is popular because they have defeated the British for the second time. It's amazing. But they didn't really defeat them, right? So this is important. Though the war was technically over, nobody knew. Newspapers ran stories of the great victory in New Orleans. And shortly after that, what is in the newspaper? Well, they come off the ship from Ghent, and they have the war is over, the Treaty of Ghent. So just imagine you're an American and you're reading the story about Andrew Jackson and the defeat of New Orleans, and what a great victory it was, how proud you are. And then a couple days later, you read in the newspaper, the war is over. You're going to think that the Battle of New Orleans was a great victory. You won the war, and that ended the war. So a lot of people, sometimes reality doesn't matter. Even though that wasn't true. It was a tie. Nobody won. But Americans felt they won, right? So they had a sense of being American, right? The different states were more united. And there's a new hero, Andrew Jackson. He's a new national hero who will later become a very controversial president, but that will be later. Well, at the same time, as I mentioned, the war is not popular, and we have the Hartford Convention. So the Federalists, especially in New England, didn't like it, right? They didn't like this war, and they're very divided, and they had no power in Congress. They were being just taken over by the Democratic Republicans. So they decided to meet in New England, in Hartford, Connecticut, and they had a list of demands. Now, some of these demands included, for example, the abolishment of the 3/5 rule. And if you remember in the Constitution, the 3/5 compromise, there was a controversy if African Americans should be included in the population count. And remember, if you have more people, you have more power, more representation in Congress, more electoral votes for choosing a president. And at that time, Boston or Massachusetts had about 2% blacks, and South Carolina had more than 50. So the South had much more power. So a 3/5 compromise, since there was many more African Americans in the South, it gave the South a lot more power. And the 3/5 compromise, they wanted to abolish that. And an example of having more power is just look at the first presidents: George Washington, Virginia; John Adams, Boston. So not him. But look at the third one: Thomas Jefferson, Virginia; James Madison, Virginia; James Monroe, Virginia; John Quincy Adams, Boston. But a lot of the power was coming from the South. So they wanted to stop the 3/5 compromise to make the power a little bit more even. They also wanted to limit the presidency to only one term, one 4-year term. And at that time, there was no limit. You could be president for the rest of your life as long as you're elected every 4 years. Now, people ended after 8 years. It became a tradition because of George Washington. until we get to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But that was the tradition. But they wanted to make it just one term. They don't want a president to have too much power and be there for too long. They also wanted the two-thirds majority in Congress to declare war. So they didn't want another one of these War of 1812s where only a majority or 51% of Congress declaring a war. Now these demands, I guess, are reasonable. It depends on your perspective. But the real big thing is there was talk about succeeding from the Union and possibly joining the British or starting a new country in New England. Now these might have just been rumors, or maybe there was some truth to this, but nonetheless those rumors spread, and the Federalists, it didn't make the Federalists look very well. But nonetheless, they bring these demands down to Washington, D.C. But before they get to Washington, D.C., what is in the newspapers? The Battle of New Orleans, and the Treaty of Ghent. And how do Americans feel? They feel proud, patriotic, very happy to defeat the British for the second time, even though they didn't defeat them. That's what they felt. So the Federalists come walking in with all these demands, and there's this news of them trying to succeed from the Union. That's going to be it. So the Federalists are gone. Now they're not gone right here, but this is the beginning of the end. They're going to be gone very soon. They'll never win another office again. So the Federalist Party is gone, and there's only one political party, the Democratic Republicans. Oh, imagine that, only one political party. Now, after the War of 1812, there was a proposition by, running out of juice, by Henry Clay. And Henry Clay wanted the United States to be more powerful. And remember, he was the war hawk who agreed with the War of 1812. He came up with an economic plan which was similar to Alexander Hamilton's American School of Ideas. This powerful, strong government, strong financial, fiscally responsible government. So he wanted to have a protective tariff to promote American industries. So people would buy stuff in America and they would tax stuff that came into America. The first national bank under Alexander Hamilton, by now it was closed. James Madison closed it before after the 20-year charter in 1811. James Madison didn't renew it. This is a continuity in American history. People love or hate the national bank. I don't know if anybody loves it, but a lot of people hate it. In the first national bank, it was very controversial. James Madison didn't do a new charter. But then the War of 1812 happened, and James Madison and Henry Clay and others said, well, you know what, maybe we do need a national bank. So they opened up a second national bank. That will last about 20 years until Andrew Jackson. Today we have the Federal Reserve. And he also wanted to do federal subsidies for roads and canals and other internal improvements. So this is kind of a strong economic plan. And it doesn't really sound like a Democratic Republican. It sounds more like a Federalist. But the American plan, and that's just trying to envision where America is at this time. It's had a lot of tumultuous years, problems with the British and the French and the Native Americans, very divisive country, lots of division between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. But now, we have a more powerful country, defeated the British. No more Federalists, so there's more peace, right? More peace. It wasn't exactly that way. But also the American system is going to make the government stronger, the financial system stronger. It's also going to unite the states. More roads. That means that people could go from state to state a little bit easier. And the next president, James Monroe, he would also further strengthen the United States. And he would also be more Federalist. So you see that with all these different political parties throughout American history. They evolve and go different ways and sometimes switch in a way. Don't get confused between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans with today's Democrats and Republicans. Different time. But James Monroe, the hero from the crossing of the Delaware, he wasn't the hero, but he got injured when he crossed the Delaware and fought the Hessians in the Battle of Trenton with George Washington. He's a veteran. He comes into office, and other Democratic Republicans, supposedly. And at this time, more and more nations in the Western Hemisphere, in Central and South America, are fighting their independence war. They're becoming free from Europe, just like the Americans did in 1776. And he supported that. And in 1823, he had a State of the Union address, which all presidents do every year. And in there, he presented an idea or a policy or maybe a threat telling the Europeans, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Don't come back here and colonize or recolonize. Stay out. You stay in Europe, and we'll do the same. We won't go to Europe. We'll stay here. So this gives the United States a lot of power. They're becoming the most dominant country in the Western Hemisphere, and they're telling the Europeans to stay out. So this is part of the development of becoming a very strong government. And just an interesting note: if you see in this picture here, look at his dress. It's James Monroe right here, on the right with the blue. Look at his shoes and his socks and his stockings, and then look at the guy in green. And I'm not even sure if I should know who they are, but the other politicians with him, they're starting to wear pants like we do today. But this guy, he's older and he's still wearing the traditional clothes back from the Revolutionary days. So he was known for that. But this is the Monroe Doctrine, and America is going to become stronger and stronger. And this is from his address. The American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. James Monroe. Yes. Did I want to say anything else about that? No. So the Monroe Doctrine. Okay. Now, when Monroe becomes president, this brings us into the era of good feelings. Now, in history, historians like to compartmentalize, kind of put everything into a little box to make it easier, right? So we often call the period after the War of 1812 and when James Monroe becomes president as the era of good feelings. And there are different reasons. Number one, the victory against the British. This powerful country, the second victory against the British, even though it wasn't a victory, but people thought it was. That's number one. Number two, the Federalists are gone. So there's no more two-party system. There's no more quarreling, no more fighting, divisiveness between the two political parties. That's over. Number three, the country's getting stronger with the American plan. The American system. The roads are uniting states. They're becoming more united, right? And also the country's just becoming stronger, more powerful. The James Monroe, the Monroe Doctrine. So historians call this the era of good feelings. So it's from after the War of 1812 to about the 1820s, early 1820s. And this was the name, it was in a newspaper. So Monroe was campaigning for his presidency up in New England, and in one of the papers it said, the era of good feelings have arrived. So it was in the newspaper, and then it got picked up and replicated, and now in history, this is what we call that time period. But you might think everybody was feeling good for all these years, but it wasn't that way. I mean, there was problems. There's still a lot of problems, right? The abolitionist debate is going to start raging, and should new states become free states or slave states? The Democratic Republicans, well, yeah, there's no Federalists, but they're going to fight with each other. So I think some people might argue it wasn't an era of good feelings, but that's what we call it, right? To help you remember American history. And that's it for this class. So we'll move on to the next class next week. Thank you for watching. If you got this far, that's amazing. I hope you did. If you did, write something below and let me know. I'm interested. And give me a like and a subscribe. And also remember, I have lots of great lesson plans and learning materials about American history, including this presentation. And just check out my store below. So, thank you.